the early days of stay-at-home orders, media outlets warned of a potential shadow epidemic. Furtively reported stories reminded Americans that there would be people sheltering in place with their abusers, and we worried there'd be a spike in deaths as a result of domestic violence. But perhaps what we didn't think about, and what we didn't warn people about, was the danger of sheltering in place with firearms. The risk of firearm fatalities by both murder and suicide. When lockdown and isolation led to intense boredom, nuclear machinist mate 3rd class Watlington worked on learning new tricks with his firearm, and tragically forgot a critical step in gun safety. This is Conduct Unbecoming. I'm Erin, and I'm your host. Nuclear machinist mate 3rd class Cody B. Watlington lived in Charleston, South Carolina, with 5 other sailors while they attended nuclear power school. The school trains both officers and enlisted students in the science fundamental to operating and maintaining naval nuclear propulsion plants. Students take classes in mathematics, nuclear physics, reactor principles, thermodynamics, and chemistry, along with a variety of other math and science topics. They typically attend between 40 and 45 hours of class each week, and spend an additional 10 to 35 hours studying. Students, justifiably, must have an active security clearance suitable to their orders before they begin training in the nation's nuclear secrets. They are also not permitted to bring any electronic devices inside the schoolhouse. No phones, no smartwatches, no noise-canceling headphones. Nothing to drown out the internal or external anguish of doing that much engineering and science study. In early April 2020, Watlington found himself with some downtime and didn't have the distraction of work. He and his roommates had just graduated from nuke school, but the COVID-related Pentagon Stop Movement order kept them in Charleston. And it's not exactly like he could work from home on the DoD's nuclear program. So Watlington tried to fill the time, though not with the brief national obsession with fermented breads. He'd recently learned there is a second way to field strip a Beretta APX pistol. Field stripping is separating the slide and its components from the frame of the gun so that it can all be cleaned. The first step in both the traditional method and this novel method is to remove the magazine and clear the chamber of any ammunition. Then, in the traditional method, the next step is to slightly retract the slide and press the striker deactivation button. Finally, it's to press the takedown lever and release the slide so it can be removed from the frame. The second way, the one Watlington learned in those early weeks of COVID, starts the same. But after retracting the slide slightly, the next step is to pull the trigger before rotating the takedown lever and removing the slide. Watlington spent some time practicing the strip down on April 7th, 2020. He removed the loaded magazine and repeatedly pulled the slide back and squeezed the trigger to release the slide. Then, Watlington reassembled his weapon, laid the gun on the living room table, and walked away. He summoned one of his roommates, machinist mate nuclear 3rd class Dakota Herring. Watlington wanted to show him what he'd learned. Watlington and Herring and 4 other sailors lived together, and most were familiar with weapons. He was confident they'd be interested in his new party trick. When Herring came in and sat down, Watlington stood in front of him, setting up to drop the slide into Herring's lap when he released it. Watlington picked up the pistol from the table, slightly pulled back the slide, and pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. Then he racked the slide and tried again, pulling back the slide slightly and squeezing the trigger. But Watlington forgot two important things about handling a firearm. First, he'd forgotten to remove the full magazine. Second, he forgot to never point his gun at anything he didn't intend to shoot. When he'd racked the slide back to reset for field stripping the pistol, he drew a bullet from the magazine and into the chamber. When he pulled back on the trigger, the firing pin detonated the priming compound in the bullet, ignited the propellant, and fired a bullet into his friend's chest, killing Herring in their shared living room. When the police arrived, Watlington told them immediately that it had been an accident, that he must have accidentally pulled the slide back far enough to chamber around, and that he forgot to remove the magazine. He hadn't intended to shoot his friend. Another roommate described it as the result of poor gun safety. Across the country at 1 a.m., Herring's family awoke to a phone call from the Goose County coroner. He was calling to inform them of Herring's death. Stay-at-home orders kept the Navy from dispatching a grief counselor or casualty assistance officer to the Herring home. In interviews, Herring's father said something like this could have been prevented. That the military always tells you safety first. That you always double-check that a gun is unloaded. In a time when his friends were complaining about being kept home and feeling cooped up with their families, Herring's father would have given anything to be all together. The Navy flew Herring's body home to Reno, Nevada for his funeral. A funeral devoid of military honors in order to comply with COVID protocols. 5 months later, the Navy handed a JAG the investigation into the death and asked whether to prefer charges. The JAG was a bit mixed up and thought he could only prefer the charges if he found them proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Nevertheless, he reviewed the file and believed himself ready to prefer the charges for violations of Article 118, murder while engaging in an act inherently dangerous to another, and Article 119, involuntary manslaughter. At the Article 32 proceeding, which is comparable to a grand jury proceeding, the preliminary hearing officer found there was no probable cause for either offense and recommended against referring the charges to a court-martial. The standard of proof is quite low at both Article 32 and grand jury proceedings. So low, in fact, that it's often said in the civilian world that a grand jury would indict a ham sandwich. The preliminary hearing officer finding no probable cause seems unusual under these circumstances from my civilian perspective. The command opted to dismiss the Article 118 charge, but disagreed with the hearing officer about the involuntary manslaughter charge and proceeded on those grounds. The Naval Reactors Command declined to exercise its convening authority and deferred to the commander of Navy Region Southeast. In forwarding the matter, Naval Reactors also noted that they believed the evidence supported the lesser-included offense of negligent homicide. The SJA, Staff Judge Advocate for Navy Region Southeast, advised the commander that he should dismiss the involuntary manslaughter charge and instead prefer charges for negligent homicide. So that command went back to the JAG that handled the preferral of charges. He preferred the new charge, negligent homicide, in front of the same preliminary hearing officer. This time, the preliminary hearing officer found there was probable cause for the negligent homicide charge, and recommended Navy Region Southeast return the case to Naval Reactors. Naval Reactors forwarded the case to the commander of the Navy's Mid-Atlantic Region, or CNRMA, and agreed to fund any court-martial should CNRMA choose to convene one. The Staff Judge Advocate advising the CNRMA recommended re-preferring the Article 118 and involuntary manslaughter charges. Round and round and round we go. Ultimately, they re-preferred only the involuntary manslaughter charge and advanced the involuntary manslaughter and lesser-included charge of negligent homicide to referral. It would be kind to describe this procedural history as a bit messy. But in late November 2021, Watlington's court-martial proceeded. I was a bit surprised that this case actually made it all the way to contested court-martial. Watlington told the responding officer that the shooting death was an accident, and there was certainly nothing to suggest that the roommates had any squabbles or that there were drugs or mental health crises in the early days of COVID stay-at-home orders. I do take Watlington at his word, that this was all a terrible and tragic accident. But it being a terrible and tragic accident all comports with it being involuntary manslaughter or negligent homicide. Few could look at the facts of this case and conclude that Watlington acted intentionally, so I guess I'm just surprised that he didn't take some kind of plea deal. At the close of the government's case, defense counsel moved for a finding of not guilty on the charge of involuntary manslaughter. They asserted there wasn't sufficient evidence to sustain a conviction. The court-martial judge could only grant their motion if there was an absence of enough evidence to establish each essential element of the offense. The judge has to look at the evidence in the light most favorable to the prosecution. And, in this case, the judge ruled there was sufficient evidence entered into the record to sustain a conviction. So, the judge denied the motion, and the court-martial continued. Well, sort of. The defense rested without presenting a case. There's some discussion on appeal about the differences between the Beretta M9, which Watlington was more familiar with, and the Beretta APX, the weapon he was playing with on April 7th, 2020. I don't know if those differences got teased out during the government's case, but if defense wanted to argue about that on appeal, I think they'd at least present some evidence during their case. I don't think this is an easy case to put on a defense for. There is no straightforward and obvious defense to offer. I don't find it particularly convincing that being less familiar with a weapon could somehow, in some way, make it more reasonable to think it was safe to point a firearm at someone and pull the trigger. The panel found Watlington guilty of both involuntary manslaughter and the lesser-included offense of negligent homicide. The military judge conditionally dismissed the negligent homicide charge because it was a lesser-included offense, and only allowed sentencing for the manslaughter conviction. The panel sentenced him to 2 years of confinement and a bad conduct discharge. On appeal to the Navy and Marine Corps Court of Criminal Appeals, the NMCCA, Watlington made 8 assignments of error. The one I always find most interesting is the assertion that the evidence was legally and/or factually insufficient to support a guilty finding, which Watlington asserted in addition to a host of others. To prove involuntary manslaughter, the government had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Herring was dead, that Watlington unlawfully killed him by shooting him in the chest with a firearm, and that Watlington's shooting Herring was the result of culpable negligence. There was no debate to the first 2 elements of the involuntary manslaughter, but on appeal, Watlington argued that the evidence didn't demonstrate that a reasonable person in the same circumstances would realize the danger. Specifically, that a reasonable person accustomed to the Beretta M9 using the Beretta APX would realize the danger. I think that's a tough row to hoe, saying that a reasonable person wouldn't realize pointing a loaded weapon at a friend's chest was dangerous. Watlington also claimed that the trial counsel was disqualified from prosecuting him because he was an accuser, that the director in charge of naval reactors engaged in unlawful command influence when he forwarded the charges and said he would fund any court-martial they chose to convene, that the trial counsel committed prosecutorial misconduct, and that a bad conduct discharge was inappropriately severe. Watlington made a few other assignments of error, but the NMCCA decided flatly that they were without merit. Because there's such a wealth of assigned errors, we're going to skip those meritless claims too. Aside from the legal or factual sufficiency, I think the most interesting assertion on appeal is Watlington's claim that trial counsel committed repeated prosecutorial misconduct. So that's what we'll delve into today. Watlington asserted that the trial counsel committed prosecutorial misconduct on 4 separate instances. First, by preferring charges where the preliminary hearing officer didn't find probable cause. Second, by participating in the court-martial despite being an accuser. Third, by misleading the judge during the motion to dismiss at the close of the government's case. And finally, fourth, by misleading the members in closing and rebuttal arguments. The first 2 allegations, that the prosecutor preferred charges without probable cause and participated in the court-martial despite being an accuser, were dealt with fairly easily. The NMCCA confirmed that a preliminary hearing officer finding no probable cause doesn't actually mean there was no probable cause. In fact, trial counsel was brand new to the role and actually thought what he needed, at the time he pursued charges, was proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Trial counsel believed, and ultimately was clearly correct, that they had enough evidence to prove that Watlington committed involuntary manslaughter. The NMCCA also easily established that the prosecutor wasn't an accuser and his participation in the court-martial was neither error nor misconduct. Which leaves us, Legal Beagle, with the duty to be honest to the court. My little ears perked up when I heard that Watlington alleged the prosecutors misled the court. That's a pretty big claim to throw around, and I was very curious what he was basing it on. First, let's look at the motion to dismiss the involuntary manslaughter charge. In arguing against the motion, government trial counsel stated that Watlington put a magazine in his Beretta APX, walked up to Herring, and pulled the trigger. This, Watlington asserted on appeal, was a problem because Watlington forgot that he was operating a Beretta APX. His defense hinged apparently on his belief that he was operating a Beretta M9, and trial counsel's argument may have implied that Watlington knew he was operating the APX. I have some strong opinions about this defense. I don't think it makes a lot of sense for Watlington's defense to hinge on the idea that he didn't know which gun he was handling. It doesn't make sense, first, because he was showing Herring a trick he'd learned and practiced for the Beretta APX. Second, pointing a loaded gun at someone, chambering around, and pulling the trigger is dangerous no matter which weapon he was handling, whether the M9 or the APX. He didn't remove the magazine from the gun before pulling back on the trigger, and that was the wrong choice, no matter which firearm he handled. The NMCCA found that trial counsel was not misleading the judge in arguing against the motion to dismiss. Even if they accepted Watlington's argument that trial counsel implied he knew which loaded gun he pointed at Herring, it's not a fact that had any bearing on the judge's analysis. Admitted evidence had included a recorded interview in which Watlington admitted that he loaded a magazine into the gun, did not unload the magazine, and attempted to disassemble the weapon using a technique that required pulling the trigger. And, they elaborated, nothing trial counsel said was factually incorrect. Watlington did load a magazine into the Beretta APX, so trial counsel's statement couldn't be misleading. Second, Watlington argued that the prosecutor misled the panel members. In closing argument, counsel argued that, basically, the Beretta APX fires just like any other gun. At the time, defense counsel, I think wisely, didn't object to the statement, so the appellate court could only evaluate it for plain error. Was it error to argue that when you load a magazine into a gun, rack the slide, and pull the trigger, it fires like any other gun? Watlington wanted the court-martial and the NMCCA to believe that there was some very important distinction between the M9 and the APX. The only distinction that could possibly matter here, the only thing defense counsel could possibly argue that would make any difference between the weapons significant to the charges, would be if somehow loading a magazine into the M9, racking the slide, and pulling the trigger wouldn't lead to the gun firing. And I don't think the defense ever got there. The NMCCA concluded there was nothing misleading about closing argument from trial counsel. The NMCCA also disposed of the argument that 2 years confinement and a bad conduct discharge were inappropriately severe, and they reminded everyone that while Watlington would have to live with the knowledge that he killed his friend in a tragic accident, at the end of the day, a sailor was dead, and Watlington was solely responsible for the loss of his life. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it. I invite you to submit case suggestions and feedback to conductunbecomingpod@gmail.com or on conductunbecomingpod.com. Join me next time when we drop in for the rapid weddings, dazzling lights, and lethal cocktails of Sin City. Until then, take care. Conduct Unbecoming is a podcast where I get to talk about interesting crimes and cases that involve U.S. military service members. I research, write, and produce the podcast myself. The opinions expressed are my own, and perhaps it's obvious, Conduct Unbecoming is not approved, endorsed, or authorized by the Department of Defense.